Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore a quiet but powerful moment when Diep and James sit down together and begin planning a journey around the world, not with dates or money, but with dreams, coffee, and the courage to imagine a future beyond their small home. If you enjoy stories about slow living, love, and meaningful dreams, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The evening settles gently around the small wooden house, the kind of quiet that only comes after a long day has fully let go. Outside, the sky's a deep shade of blue, not quite dark yet, with a thin line of orange fading behind the hills. Inside, the light from a single lamp spreads warmly across the room, touching the wooden walls, the simple shelves, and the long table that James built with his own hands. Diep places 2 cups of coffee on the table. The coffee isn't fancy, not measured or timed perfectly, but it carries a familiar, comforting smell. James sits across from her, leaning back slightly, stretching his shoulders as if he's trying to shake off the day. They don't rush to speak. Silence has become something easy between them, something that doesn't need filling right away. After a moment, Diep stands up again and walks toward the corner of the room. James watches her quietly as she pulls something out from a thin drawer beneath the bookshelf. When she returns, she's holding a folded piece of paper worn at the edges. James raises an eyebrow, a small smile forming. "What's that?" he asks casually. Diep doesn't answer right away. She sets the paper down in the middle of the table and slowly unfolds it. As the paper spreads open, James leans forward. A world map appears, old and slightly faded, with creases running through the oceans and continents. James lets out a soft laugh. "Wow," he says. "That's unexpected." Diep sits back down, smoothing the map with her hands. "I found it this afternoon," she replies. "It was tucked inside one of the boxes we never opened." James takes a sip of coffee, eyes still on the map. "And what are you planning to do with the whole world on our table?" he asks, half joking. Diep looks up at him, her expression calm but thoughtful. "I want to make a schedule," she says. James almost chokes on his coffee. "A schedule?" he repeats. "For all of this?" She nods. "Not to go right away," she quickly adds. "Just a plan." James leans back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Plan a trip around the world?" he asks, incredulous but amused. Diep smiles faintly. "Why not?" she says softly. James studies her face. She doesn't look impulsive or overly excited. Instead, there's a quiet seriousness in her eyes, the kind that makes him pause before dismissing the idea. He reaches out and lightly taps the map. "Where would we even start?" he asks. Diep picks up a pen from beside her cup. She doesn't answer immediately. Instead, she looks down, scanning the map slowly as if each country carries a memory or a question. Then she circles a small spot. "Here," she says, "Japan." James nods slowly. "Cherry blossoms," he says. "You used to talk about that a lot." Diep smiles at the memory. "I did," she says. "I always imagined standing under those trees just once." She moves the pen again, circling another place. "And here, France," James chuckles. "Coffee again," he teases. "Always," Diep replies. "But not to rush, just sitting outside, watching people walk by." They continue like that, marking places lightly, not too many, never filling the map completely. An island here, a city there. None of them feel urgent. None of them feel impossible either. After a while, James grows quiet. He stares at the map longer than before, his fingers resting on the edge of the table. "You know," he says slowly, "I used to think travelling like this was something for another life." Diep looks at him. "What do you mean?" James exhales. "Back when everything was fast," he says. "I thought if I didn't do it then, I never would." He pauses, searching for the right words. "And after we moved here, I stopped thinking about it altogether." Diep doesn't interrupt. She listens, her hands folded loosely in front of her. "I told myself," James continues, "that choosing this life meant letting go of those dreams." Diep shakes her head gently. Choosing this life doesn't mean giving up dreams, she says. It just means they change shape. James looks at her, unsure. But what about the house? The work? Everything we're building here? Diep reaches across the table, placing her hand over his. That's exactly why I want to plan, she says quietly. Not to escape, but to remember why we're doing all this. James lets her words sink in. The room feels warmer, heavier with meaning. So, he asks after a moment, this schedule, what does it look like? Diep smiles again, this time a little brighter. It doesn't have dates, she says, just seasons. Someday. When we're ready. James laughs softly. That's not much of a schedule. It's enough for me, Diep replies. They sit together, the world spread out between them, not as a promise, not as pressure, but as possibility. Outside, the sky darkens completely and the first stars begin to appear. James reaches for the pen. Diep watches him, surprised but silent. He doesn't circle a country. Instead, he writes a small note near the corner of the map. Start here, he says aloud as he writes. Diep leans closer and reads the words. Home, she whispers. James nods. No matter how far we go, he says, this is where we begin and where we come back. Diep feels her chest tighten slightly, not from sadness, but from something full and steady. She folds the map carefully, as if it's something fragile, and places it back in the drawer. James pours a little more coffee into both cups. Funny, he says. We haven't gone anywhere, but I already feel like we've started. Diep lifts her cup and smiles at him. Me too, she says. The night continues quietly, but something has shifted. Not outside, not in their routine, but inside them. A journey has begun, not with footsteps, but with intention. The night grows deeper around the house, settling into a quiet that feels thicker, almost protective. The lamp on the table is still on, casting a soft yellow circle where the map had been only moments ago. Even though it's folded away now, its presence lingers, as if the room itself remembers the lines and shapes of distant places. Diep rinses the empty coffee cups at the small sink, moving slowly, thoughtfully. The sound of water fills the silence for a moment, steady and calm. James stands near the window, looking out at the dark outline of the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. Somewhere far off, a dog barks once, then stops. When Diep finishes, she dries her hands and joins him by the window. They stand side by side, not touching, but close enough to feel each other's warmth. You know, James says quietly, still staring outside, I didn't realise how long it's been since I last thought about the future. Diep turns her head to look at him. You think about tomorrow all the time, she says. Work, weather, what needs fixing. James smiles faintly. That's not the future I meant, he replies. That's just surviving. He pauses, then adds, Tonight felt different. Diep nods. It did, she agrees, because we weren't planning out of fear. James glances at her. Fear of what? Of missing out, she says softly, or of staying stuck. They fall quiet again, listening to the night. After a while, James steps away from the window and walks back to the table. He pulls the drawer open and takes the folded map out once more, placing it gently in front of them. Let's look at it one more time, he says. Diep sits down, curious but calm. He unfolds the map carefully, smoothing it out as she had done earlier. This time James studies it more closely, tracing invisible lines with his finger. If we really did this, he says slowly, we wouldn't be chasing landmarks. Diep smiles. No, she agrees. We'd be chasing mornings. James chuckles. Mornings? She nods. Different light, different sounds. But the same coffee, she says. James taps the table thoughtfully. I used to think travelling meant moving fast, he admits, seeing as much as possible before time runs out. And now? Diep asks. And now, he says, I think I'd rather sit somewhere unfamiliar and feel at home. Her eyes soften at his words. They begin talking again, not about destinations this time, but about what they would carry with them. James says he wouldn't want heavy luggage. Diệp agrees, saying she'd only bring a notebook, something to write in when the days feel too full. What about souvenirs? James asks. Diep shakes her head. Only memories, she replies, and maybe photos we never post. James laughs quietly. That sounds like us. The conversation drifts naturally, like a river with no rush. They talk about places they don't know much about, admitting openly that they don't need to understand everything in advance. There's comfort in that uncertainty. At some point, James folds the map again, slower this time. He doesn't put it away right away. Instead, he rests his hand on top of it. Do you ever worry, he asks, that we'll plan all this and never go? Diep considers the question carefully. Sometimes, she admits. But I worry more about never planning at all. James nods, understanding. Even if we only make it to one place, she continues, that's still a journey. James looks at her, his expression thoughtful. And if we never leave this house, he asks. Diep smiles gently. Then this will still be the place where we allowed ourselves to dream. Her words settle between them, solid and reassuring. James stands up and walks toward the shelf where a small stack of notebooks sits. He picks one up, flips through a few blank pages, then brings it back to the table. What are you doing? Diep asks. Making it official, he says, handing her the notebook. On the first page, he writes a simple title, A Slow Trip Around the World. Diep laughs softly, touched. That sounds perfect, she says. She takes the pen and writes underneath, no deadlines, no pressure. They close the notebook together and place it beside the map, as if the two belong to each other now. The clock on the wall ticks softly, reminding them that time is still moving, even in moments like this. Eventually, James begins turning off the lights, one by one, leaving only the lamp by the bed on. As they settle in for the night, Diep lies on her back, staring at the ceiling. James lies beside her, hands folded over his chest. James, she says after a moment. Yeah? Thank you for not laughing at me tonight. He turns his head toward her. I almost did, he admits, but I'm glad I didn't. She smiles in the darkness. Outside, the wind brushes past the house, carrying the scent of earth and leaves. The world feels vast, but not overwhelming. Just before sleep takes her, Diep speaks again. When we do go, she says softly, I don't care where it is first. James reaches out and finds her hand, squeezing it gently. Me neither, he replies, as long as we go together. The room grows quiet once more. Their breathing slowly sinks, steady and calm. Somewhere in the drawer, the folded map rests, untouched but alive with possibility. They haven't booked flights. They haven't chosen dates. But something important has shifted. The future no longer feels like a closed door. It feels like a road, long and winding, starting right where they are. And in that small wooden house under a quiet night sky, their journey continues, one shared dream at a time.
Chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO quang ghế đến lắng nghe và trấn an sự và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người Nếu nếu thấy video hay hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.